Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction and is written solely for emotional and dramatic entertainment. It explores themes of personal relationships, emotional tension, and moral dilemmas. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real-life events is purely coincidental. The content is intended for a mature audience. I never thought a simple, friendly gesture could change everything between us. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind that made the whole house smell of damp earth and comfort. I was in the living room, curled up with a blanket, when Daniel walked in, looking like he'd just carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You look tense," I said, half teasing. He sighed and gave me a tired smile. "It's been a rough week. My back's killing me." I don't know what made me say it. Maybe the weather, maybe the way his voice sounded worn down, but the words slipped out before I could think. "Do you want me to give you a massage?" He looked at me with a mix of surprise and hesitation. "You do massages?" I laughed lightly. "Not professionally, obviously. But I've picked up a few tricks. I mean, if you want." There was a beat of silence. For a moment, I wondered if I'd overstepped. But then he nodded. "Yeah, sure. That actually sounds nice." We moved to the couch, pushing the coffee table aside. The air between us felt normal, at least for now. I'd known Daniel for years. We had spent countless hours talking, laughing, and sharing small pieces of our lives. This was just another moment between friends, or so I told myself. As I placed my hands on his shoulders, I noticed the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his t-shirt. His muscles were tense, knotted from stress. I started gently, pressing my thumbs in slow circles. He let out a low breath, almost a sigh, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. The rain outside drummed softly against the windows, creating a cocoon of quiet intimacy. It wasn't anything unusual, but something about this moment felt different, like the air had shifted, just slightly. "You're really good at this," he murmured, his voice low and relaxed. I smiled, keeping my tone light. "Told you I had a few tricks." But inside, I felt something stir, an awareness I hadn't felt before. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. By the time I finished, Daniel looked more at ease, his eyes softer. He thanked me, and I brushed it off with a casual anytime. Still, as I sat back down and watched him stretch, I couldn't shake the faint buzz of electricity lingering in my hands. I didn't know it then, but that simple offer had planted the first seed of something that would grow into a moment neither of us could ever take back. A few days later, the rain was gone, replaced by a warm summer night. The air felt thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the cicadas sang their restless chorus outside. It was one of those evenings when the house was unusually quiet. My roommate was out for the weekend, and Daniel had stopped by after work, claiming he just wanted to hang out. We ordered takeout, ate on the couch, and talked about everything and nothing. The light from the TV flickered across his face, making his expression seem softer, warmer. I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before, the way he laughed with one corner of his mouth slightly higher than the other, the way his eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary when they met mine. At some point, the conversation drifted to stressful week again. He mentioned his shoulders still felt stiff, and without thinking I said, "I can fix that." He glanced at me, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Another massage?" I shrugged, trying to seem casual even though my pulse had quickened. "If you're lucky." We set up in the living room again. The lamp in the corner cast a warm, golden glow, making the shadows stretch across the walls. Outside, the world felt far away. Inside, it was just the two of us in a quiet bubble. He sat in front of me, and I began kneading his shoulders. This time, I noticed the way his body leaned into my touch almost immediately, as if he trusted me completely. His breathing slowed, deepened, and I could feel the rhythm of it under my palms. "Feels amazing," he murmured, his voice husky from relaxation. I swallowed, forcing my hands to move steadily, like this was still nothing more than friendly help. But there was an unspoken change, an invisible thread pulling tighter between us. The weight of his body under my hands, the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of his cologne, it all made the air heavier, harder to breathe. A part of me wanted to pull back, to stop before my thoughts wandered further. But another part, one I didn't recognize, wanted to keep going, to see where this strange, quiet tension might lead. When I shifted my hands to his neck, my fingertips brushed the soft skin just below his hairline. He shivered not from cold, but from something else entirely. I felt the same thing ripple through me. Neither of us said a word, but the silence was thick, loaded with the things we weren't brave enough to voice. When I finally stopped, the moment lingered like a secret. He turned slightly, catching my eyes, and for a heartbeat, we just stared. Then he smiled faintly. "You really do have magic hands." I laughed it off, but inside, my thoughts were racing. The massage was over, but the quiet, electric charge between us was only just beginning to hum. I told myself it was nothing. Just a friendly gesture, twice in 1 week, nothing more. But the truth was, ever since that quiet summer night, I'd been catching myself thinking about Daniel more than I should. Not in the way I used to, friendly, familiar, but in a way that made my stomach tighten and my thoughts wander where they shouldn't. The next time I saw him, it was at my place again. He came over late in the afternoon, carrying a bag of groceries and insisting he was going to cook dinner for both of us. It felt comfortable, natural, until it didn't. As we stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, his hand brushed mine when he reached for the cutting board. It was a small thing, completely ordinary, but the touch lingered just a little too long. My pulse reacted instantly, like my body knew something my mind was still trying to deny. During dinner, he kept smiling at me, soft, unguarded smiles that felt like they were meant for no one else. I tried to focus on the food, on the conversation, but every time his gaze met mine, I felt that quiet pull again. After we ate, we ended up back in the living room. He stretched out on the couch, sighing like he owned the place, and said, "You know, my shoulders have been killing me again." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're making this a habit." "Maybe I am," he said, with a grin that felt almost teasing. Reluctantly, or maybe not so reluctantly, I sat behind him and began working on his shoulders again. This time, the air between us was different from the very first touch. I could feel the tension in his muscles melting away, but I could also feel the way his body responded to me. Every sigh, every shift, every slight lean back into my hands was like a wordless conversation neither of us wanted to stop. When my thumbs traced the knots along his upper back, his head tilted forward, exposing the curve of his neck. I don't know why, but my eyes lingered there, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered what it would feel like to press my lips against that skin. The thought startled me so much I almost pulled my hands away, but I didn't. Instead, I kept going, my fingers moving slower now, more deliberate. His breathing deepened, and I realized with a jolt that mine had too. When I finally stopped, he turned to face me. His eyes held mine for longer than felt safe, and something unspoken passed between us, something that felt like the first crack in the wall we had always kept up. Neither of us mentioned it. We just sat there, the TV flickering in the background, pretending nothing had shifted. But deep down, I knew we had crossed into new territory, one where the rules we'd lived by no longer applied. It happened on a Thursday night, the kind that doesn't feel special until you look back and realize it changed everything. Daniel had been at my place for hours. We'd ordered pizza, laughed over a dumb movie, and talked about work stress. It was comfortable, too comfortable. Maybe that's why neither of us saw it coming. When the movie ended, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. He stretched, his shirt riding up slightly, revealing a sliver of skin. I looked away instantly, pretending I hadn't noticed, but my chest felt tight. "You know what I'm going to ask," he said with a smirk. I rolled my eyes. "Another massage?" He didn't answer, just nodded and turned around so his back was facing me. I sighed dramatically, pretending it was an inconvenience, but inside, I felt that strange rush again. My hands found his shoulders easily now, like they'd learned the map of his body. The moment I touched him, his head dropped forward, and he exhaled like the weight of the week was sliding off him. But this time, I didn't stick to safe areas. My hands drifted lower, to the middle of his back, then up to his neck, fingers brushing along the edges of his jaw. His skin was warm under my touch, and I felt him stiffen slightly, not in discomfort, but in awareness. Feels different tonight, he murmured. I froze for half a second. Different how? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head, just enough that his eyes met mine over his shoulder. The look in them was charged, like the air right before a storm. In that moment, the silence was louder than words. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow, and I realized my hands were still resting on him, not massaging anymore, just holding him there. He didn't move away. In fact, he leaned back slightly, closing the space between us. I felt the side of his face brush against mine, so lightly it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. You know this isn't just a massage anymore, right? He whispered. The words hung there, heavy and impossible to ignore. I wanted to speak, to say something that would make sense of the rush of emotions flooding me, but I couldn't. Instead, my hands slid slowly down his arms, and he turned fully to face me. For a long second, we just stared at each other, breathing in sync. And then, without planning it, without even thinking, I let my hand linger against his chest. The line we'd both pretended didn't exist was gone. We didn't cross it with an obvious act. We crossed it with that touch, that look, that silent understanding that nothing between us would ever be the same. That night after he left, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, the way his eyes locked on mine, the weight of his voice when he said it wasn't just a massage anymore, and the way my chest had ached, not with guilt exactly, but with something heavier. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't bring it up. We could pretend nothing happened. But when I saw Daniel again, all my rehearsed composure melted the moment he walked in. He didn't come over for dinner this time. He just showed up, unannounced, standing at my door with his hands shoved in his pockets and a look on his face that told me he'd been thinking about last night too. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. Hey, he echoed, but his voice was quieter. He stepped inside, and for a few moments, we just stood there, the space between us feeling too small for the silence we carried. I can't stop thinking about it, he finally said. My breath caught. About what? You know what, he said, his eyes steady on mine. Last night. The way you touched me. The way it felt. I swallowed hard, my mind scrambling for something safe to say. Daniel, it was just, no, he interrupted softly. It wasn't just anything. And you know it. The truth of his words landed like a stone in my stomach. I wanted to deny it, to keep the line intact, but that line had already dissolved in my hands. I don't know what this means, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a small step closer, closing the distance until I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. It means something, he said firmly. I don't care how complicated it is. I felt something, and I think you did too. I looked down, afraid that if I met his eyes for too long, my defenses would crumble completely. I finally confessed, the words escaping before I could stop them. It was like a dam breaking. The relief of saying it was instantly followed by a rush of fear of what this could do to us, to everything we'd built over the years. Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing mine in a tentative, almost shy gesture. So, what do we do now? He asked. I shook my head slowly. I don't know. We stood there in the living room, holding onto the smallest thread of contact, both of us knowing that this was no longer a secret tucked away in our own thoughts. We had spoken it into existence, given it life. And once it was out there was no taking it back. The days that followed our confession were complicated. We didn't see each other as often, not because we didn't want to, but because neither of us knew how to act. Every text felt loaded, every glance a little too long, every casual word carrying an undercurrent of what had been said. When we did meet, the air was different. Our usual ease had been replaced by a strange mix of tension and awareness. Sitting side by side felt almost dangerous, like touching a live wire, one wrong move, and we'd both be jolted back into that moment. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The look in his eyes, the warmth of his voice, the certainty with which he'd said it meant something. And the terrifying part was, he was right. It did mean something. One evening, about a week later, I saw him again at a mutual friend's small get-together. We hadn't planned to meet there, but the moment our eyes found each other across the room, it was like the rest of the people blurred into background noise. We tried to keep things light, talking in a group, laughing at jokes, pretending nothing had changed. But every time our eyes met, I felt that same charge, that same quiet pull. At one point, he passed behind me in the kitchen, and his hand brushed my lower back, just for a second, but enough to make my breath hitch. No one else noticed, but I knew. And so did he. Later that night, after the party, he walked me to my car. The street was quiet, the cool air wrapping around us. For a moment, we stood there, neither of us getting in, neither of us leaving. "How are you?" he asked finally, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "I don't know," I admitted truthfully. "It's like, I can't stop thinking about it, but I don't know if I want to." His eyes searched mine, like he was looking for permission to say what he really wanted. "Me neither," he said quietly. "It's messing with my head." We stood in that small bubble of silence, the unspoken thoughts swirling between us. I could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said yet pressing in on us, making it harder to breathe. "I miss how easy things used to be," I said finally. He nodded. "Yeah, but maybe they were only easy because we were pretending we didn't feel this." The truth of his words scared me, because deep down I knew he might be right. We didn't touch that night. We didn't make any promises or decisions. But as I drove away, my hands tight on the steering wheel, I realized something important. There was no going back to the way things were. Whatever we were now, we were already in it. It took us another week to finally stop avoiding the inevitable. Daniel texted me late on a Sunday morning. "Can we talk? Properly?" My chest tightened. I typed back yes before I could convince myself to say no. When he arrived that afternoon, he didn't bring his usual smile. His hands were buried in his hoodie pockets, and his eyes looked tired, like he'd been carrying our secret around like a weight he couldn't put down. We sat on opposite ends of the couch at first, an awkward gulf between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't know what's worse, pretending nothing happened, or knowing that it did and not doing anything about it." I looked at him, my throat tight. "We can't just act like it didn't happen." "But we also can't." I trailed off, the words I wanted to say tangled up with the ones I was afraid to. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "You know why," I said, sharper than I intended. "Because once we cross that line, there's no undoing it. And we could ruin everything." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "But what if we've already crossed it?" The truth of that hung in the air between us. My heart pounded, because deep down I knew he was right. That first touch, that first moment when our eyes said more than our words ever could, that was the crossing. "I keep thinking about that night," he continued. "The way you looked at me. The way it felt when your hands were on me. I can't pretend it was nothing." I swallowed, my voice trembling. "It wasn't nothing. But it's not simple either." He nodded slowly, finally looking up at me. "I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for honest. Do you want this? Do you want me?" My breath caught. I'd been avoiding the answer for weeks, convincing myself that not saying it would make it less real. But now, staring into his eyes, I couldn't lie. "Yes," I whispered. "I want you. But I'm scared." He moved closer, closing the distance until his knee brushed mine. "I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared with you than go back to pretending." The silence that followed wasn't awkward this time. It was heavy with possibility. I could feel the pull between us again, that invisible thread that seemed determined to draw us closer no matter how much we resisted. For the first time, we weren't pretending anymore. We weren't hiding behind casual touches or unsaid words. We were looking the truth straight in the face, and it terrified me just as much as it thrilled me. After that conversation, there was no pretending, no going back to the way things were. We hadn't decided on rules or labels, but the air between us was charged in a way that couldn't be undone. Every time we saw each other, it felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong step, and we'd tumble into something we couldn't hide. The next weekend, he came over again. This time, there was no movie, no dinner, no distractions. He just showed up and sat on the couch beside me, his presence alone making my chest ache. We talked for a while, but it felt like we were circling something much bigger. And then, almost without realizing it, I asked, "Do you want a massage?" It wasn't the same innocent question I'd asked weeks ago. We both knew that. His eyes locked on mine, steady and unflinching. "Yeah," he said quietly. I moved behind him, placing my hands on his shoulders. The moment I touched him, it was different, slower, more deliberate. Every movement felt intentional, like we were both aware of exactly where this was going. He leaned back slightly, his head tilting so he could glance up at me. That look, half vulnerable, half certain, was the final thread snapping. I didn't know who moved first, but suddenly, we weren't just sitting there anymore. The massage ended in a moment neither of us could have predicted when this all began. We crossed the last line between what we'd been and what we were becoming. Afterward, we sat in silence, the weight of it settling over us. There was no awkwardness, but there was an undeniable awareness that nothing about our lives would be the same. "This changes everything," I said softly. He nodded, his hand finding mine. Maybe that's not a bad thing. We didn't make promises. We didn't try to name it. All we knew was that something had shifted permanently. In the days that followed, I noticed how different the world felt. Texts from him carried a warmth they never had before. His visits felt more intimate, his presence more necessary. And yet, there was still that edge of uncertainty. Were we building something lasting, or had we set ourselves on a path that could only end in heartbreak? I didn't have the answer. Maybe I didn't want it yet. What I did know was that the massage, the one that started as a simple, harmless gesture, had changed us forever. It had cracked open something neither of us had dared to touch, something that was both beautiful and terrifying. And as I sat across from him one quiet evening, watching the way he smiled at me now, I realized that even if I didn't know where this would lead, I couldn't regret it. Because some lines, once crossed, aren't meant to be redrawn. 3.